The reading this morning is from the Acts of the Apostles, the first chapter, verses 6 through 14. It can be found on page 118 in the New Testament section of the Pew Bible. Listen for the word of God. So when they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" He replied, "It is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going, and they were gazing up toward heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven? This Jesus, who has been taken from you up into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. When they had entered the city, they went to the room upstairs where they were staying. Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas, son of James. All these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. The word of the Lord.
Who has seen the Pixar animated movie Up? Okay, good number of us. Paul and I went to see it when it first came out about 5 years ago as a way to celebrate our wedding anniversary. Our family re-watched the movie Up the other night in celebration of our 15th wedding anniversary. Up begins with a lovely relationship between 2 young adventurers, Ellie and Carl. Recall that Ellie and Carl end up eventually getting married and spending their life together. They adventure through the ups and downs of life and share the mundanity of household chores and the whimsy of picnics, parties, and flower picking. When Ellie dies, Carl is alone, and he becomes a grumpy old man. Carl has to get out of his neighborhood because developers are moving in all around him and his home. He's also being pushed to move into a retirement home. And so he takes matters into his own hands. He concocts a plan of moving the beloved house that he and Ellie shared for so many years to a faraway place near the waterfalls in South America, a place to which he and Ellie had always dreamed of going. In order to carry out his plan, he fills hundreds of balloons with helium and attaches them to the house so that when the time comes for the journey, he's ready. Up and away he goes in his house to the place of his and Ellie's dreams. He's off on an adventure. And along the way, he finds he has some surprising traveling companions, such as an 8-year-old boy wilderness explorer named Russell, and a rare bird, and a talking dog. Much of the movie takes place in the clouds in Carl's helium balloon held up home. You have perhaps seen the magical image of the hundreds of multicolored balloons attached to an old Victorian home, carrying it through the clouds. It is far-fetched, but it works. And he is up and on his way. In my mind, the movie has a bit of an ascension theme. This past Thursday, the Christian church celebrated the ascension of Jesus Christ. The church marks the ascension of Jesus 40 days after Easter. The passage that we heard that Connie read to us from Acts gives us an account of Jesus' ascension. The author of Luke and Acts, and scholars are fairly certain that the same author wrote Luke and Acts. The author of Luke and Acts is the only gospel writer who gives us such a full account of the ascension of Jesus. The author affixes the span of time of 40 days, which is a time of completion in the Bible, 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. And with the account of the ascension, Luke brings closure to the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. The ascension is an intermediate link between the resurrection and the gift of the Spirit at Pentecost. The gift we'll celebrate next Sunday. In his book, Letters from a Skeptic, Gregory Boyd writes to his skeptical father this about the ascension. According to the Gospels, it wasn't the resuscitation of a corpse which convinced the disciples that Jesus was God incarnate. It was the resurrection of a man who had already embodied the kingdom of God, its love, its teachings, its power during his life. It was the resurrection of a man who had already made astounding claims for himself. And it was the resurrection of a man who never did henceforth die. If Jesus had later died, the whole thing would have fallen to pieces. But he didn't. He ascended to heaven. If this isn't true, one must answer the questions of where was Jesus hiding during the entire period of the early church? Why and how the disciples would lie and then die for their fabrication, and why this lie was never exposed or even suspected by anyone. What would we have seen had we been there at the ascension? What is going on in this passage? I have the image of multicolored balloons appearing, attaching themselves to and carrying up and away that which is so treasured and valued. From the passage as we read it in Acts, we get the real sense that Jesus appeared and ascended into heaven. We can't help but wonder and chuckle to ourselves when Luke says, Jesus ascended into heaven. On and on go the questions and the doubts and the shaking of our heads. And we become like the apostles, standing and gazing up into heaven, wondering what it all means. And then these two men in white, these angels in our passage, ask the question becomes addressed to us. Why are you standing around gazing into heaven, wondering, doubting, when there's a job to do? New Testament scholar Matt Skinner encourages us not to get caught up in parsing the symbolic sights and imagery of the ascension narrative. Acts, operating out of its own cosmological assumptions, resists our questions of where and how. What Acts insists is that Jesus departs from his followers so that he might exercise his authority and influence over all things, all places, and all powers. The ascension does not mean the cessation of Jesus' ministry. It doesn't mean Jesus' absence. It doesn't mean the suspension of God's activity to reclaim the world. Quite the opposite. And New Testament scholar Elizabeth Achtemeyer, in her book, Reading from the Old Testament with Eyes to the New, says this: Jesus now enjoys a universal rule over all people from the right hand of God's power. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. He told us. I believe that was the passage we heard last week. Jesus ascended up into heaven, and he also ascended away from this world. He left. He separated himself from us. Jesus had to do this for the church to be created. It seems that human acts of creation need a separation before these acts can be fully realized. Poets separate from society around them. One poet has called it walking on the heads of the people he writes about without touching them, so as seeing all about them. Philosophers, too, in order to speak fully of the truths they see in the world, separate themselves from what they contemplate. And that's why artists and thinkers are often solitary, men and women. Women give birth. They need to give birth as a form of separation. Parents need to separate from their children in order for these creations to be fully realized. Jesus needs to separate his humanness from the world by leaving it and so fully realize his Godhead, his fullness of power and might. We witness this separation when we read about and imagine Christ's ascension. The result of this act of separation isn't a great poem or philosophical insight. It is the creation of the Christian church in its fullness of authority and universality. And this is what we witness when we recite the Apostles' Creed. I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, our Lord. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father, and he will come to judge the living and the dead. Jesus was entrusting everything he had lived and died for to the disciples and to his followers yet to be born, to us. His ascension was a calling. His ascension was a calling to be his witnesses for him, to take over his mission. So our assignment is to witness. That's Christ's plan. Witnesses, people who have experienced Christ in their own lives and are willing to share that experience with others. And then the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we good witnesses? According to the New Testament, if we're followers of Christ, then we're witnesses. We're either witnesses for Christ or witnesses against Christ. We kid ourselves if we think we can hide our light under a bushel without it eventually going out altogether. I was at a soccer barbecue yesterday, and these were with the coaches in John Paul's soccer league. And the children were all shooting the ball on goal, and Keegan, one of John Paul's teammates, made a great save. And one of the coaches said, in a manner and tone that was slightly teasing, "Jesus saves, but Keegan gets the rebound." And then he looked right at me. And he said, "Oh, sorry." Half apology, half in mischief. And at first, reacting to the mischief of the moment, I was taken aback. And then I thought, well, at least Jesus gets a shout out. And this coach knows I'm a witness. So in both of these ways, God's presence is made known here. The new purpose for living, which Jesus gave his followers on that day when he ascended into heaven, is the calling to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. And these students turned teachers had been given history's greatest gift, a personal knowledge and relationship with Jesus Christ. Their task now was to spread that gift. Why look to heaven, the men in white ask. Start looking around you. Why stay on this mountain of ascension? Go to the ends of the earth. In a departure scene that was unnerving at the time, Christ offers the disciples, and Christ offers us, the freedom and the opportunity to grow, to go out from student to teacher, from follower to leader, from observer to healer. The ascension signals a change in the relationship between God, in the person of Jesus, and humankind. Jesus is with us, but not in the way he was when he was a man. No longer are we to leave the world to be in Jesus, the person's presence. No longer are we to leave our places of work and our families to join the man Jesus as he travels in ancient Judea. Now we are to enter the world. Enter again our families and our places of work, knowing Jesus is with us now, not as a man, but as God, as the Spirit. Jesus says, remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age. Recall Carl from the movie Up. Carl finally has to be separated from his house, which is really the arc of his love for his wife, Ellie. His house literally ascends into the clouds and finally settles to rest upon the right side of the waterfall in South America. And once his house has ascended, has separated from him, Carl receives his mission. The gift of knowledge of what it is he's to do with his life. He gets down out of the clouds and he builds a bond, he builds a relationship with the 8-year-old boy Russell, such that he helps Russell experience the love of a father, the father the boy never had. And Carl, he experiences the love of a son, the child he never had. The movie ends with the two of them, feet firmly planted on the ground, living out the love we are called upon to share with one another to the ends of the earth. It ends with them enjoying ice cream cones together, enjoying a meal together. And so we find ourselves today, feet firmly planted on the ground, enjoying a meal together. We gather at this table renewed in our love for our Lord, as we are aware that he is seated at the right hand of the Father. We gather at this table renewed in our love for our Lord, as we live out his command to be witnesses. We gather at this table renewed in our love for our Lord, as we know Christ is present among us, strengthening us to get up and go. Up we go, to be witnesses to the places we work and play, to the waterfalls of South America, to the soccer fields of Northern Virginia. Come, up we go.